This week we'll be talking about strategies you can use to add depth to your stories, including imagined scenes, backstory, prolepsis, which is flash forwards, true and false mystery. You should have an essay called Rhyming Action by Charles Baxter, as well as a story by Alice Munro called Miles City, Montana. And we'll also take a second look at the story Walking Out by David Quammen. So what Charles Baxter calls rhyming action is something that I think Alice Munro does really amazingly in her stories when she plays with time or has imagined scenes or reflects on a moment when an earlier moment is made real and important in her stories. One of the things you might notice about Munro's stories is that with a typical story, we might tell the story of a point in a person's life that is most important, but Munro might take that story and tell a story of when in a person's life a moment becomes most important. That's an interesting way of thinking about a story, and it includes a lot of what Baxter is talking about in his essay. It includes a sort of mirroring and collapsing of time and returning to a starting point that Baxter talks about. I like this part of the essay where Baxter says, prophecy run forward gives the prophet the power of forecasting and a habit of denunciation. Prophecy run backward into rhyming action or déjà vu gives the participant a power of understanding. A forward prophetic power is worldly and has something to do with magic and foresight. A reverse prophecy, a sense of rhymed events, is unworldly and has something to do with insight. It moves us back into ourselves. Munro often does what Flannery O'Connor says, right? Gets to the surprising but inevitable moments. The example Baxter gives to go along with this paragraph on prophecy run backward is the story of the boy with the kite who grows up to see a couple flying a kite and the woman wearing a yellow dress, which makes him remember that earlier moment from his childhood and resolve something from his childhood that allows him to take action in the present. So we want these rhyming moments, these rhyming actions, but we don't want them, as Baxter says, we don't want them to feel obvious. We don't want the reader to know that they're happening and for them to break the fictive dream, right? We don't want the moments in our story to become or to feel contrived. Baxter says that depth in a story often comes from echo effects, rhyming action, but he also says that the reader needs to forget the original action before the rhyme happens. And we should talk a little bit about how to make a reader notice something or forget something. Right? We want the reader to forget at first and then notice the second time when it comes back. So how can I argue that the best forms of rhyming action are probably half-conscious? If this technique is used too consciously, it probably won't work. How can I argue for a half-conscious relaxing of the grip, for half-thinking? It feels to me as if I've worked myself into a false position, but in practice I believe it is probably not false at all. When we write, we read what we have already written. Then, if we are not too anxious, we allow associations to mingle with those elements we have already laid down. We do so in a state of alert attentiveness that welcomes memory and progression and puts them on the same stage and then lets them go. Here he's arguing for us to read our stories aloud, or at least to ourselves as we write. Aloud, I think, is the best way of doing this. It lets us hear what he calls the sound of the rhyming action. And then, as we write forward and as we revise, those things that we have read over are lodged in our subconscious as they would be lodged in the reader's subconscious, and hopefully will come back again as we go. We can also make notes of the things that we have earlier in the story and look for missed opportunities where the things that we have written into the story can do more work later in a story than they currently do. In the Munro story, there's a deer that they see on top of a car during their drive, and it's just a passing moment. The middles are where the reader pays the least attention, right? Beginnings and endings are where the reader pays the most attention. The beginnings and ends of paragraphs, the beginnings and ends of scenes, the beginnings and ends of sentences, and of stories. And that can work to our advantage. When we put something in the middle originally, and then it comes back at the beginning or the end of a paragraph, or the beginning and end of a sentence or the end of a story. You want it to be more subtle the first time than the second time. Now let's look at the story and let's talk about some of these tools that I'm calling the depth toolbox. So if we look first at backstory, you'll see that Monroe adds the backstory in the way that we talked about with the Saunders story, to put pressure on the current story, but also to do some other interesting things here. For example, the whole opening scene, which we might read as the present of the story, we soon realize is backstory to the story of the road trip. That backstory is what adds this sort of sinister undertone, as some of my classes have called it, to the rest of the story, right? There's a certain tension built into that backstory and the idea that it will somehow reappear in the current story, which we feel as readers of fiction, because of the way that fiction works and the way that we know fiction works and what our expectations are for the story. I think one thing that Monroe does really well is plays with those expectations, subverts them, and uses them to her advantage. We also have the backstory on page 34 and 35 of the New Yorker version that I have, where we hear about the parents of the narrator and of Andrew, and we see how their upbringing was similar but very different at the same time. And this comes shortly after the prolepsis, where we hear that they have split up in the future of the story. Now, why does she put the backstory here? Why do we have it directly after that prolepsis? Why does she get away with this very long section of backstory here? One, I think, because it's increasing the mystery and the suspense of the story to hear first that they broke up, and then to hear that about their problems and their differences, but to know in the current story that they are together, and to think about how they broke up. And we'll talk about this a little later with true and false mystery. That's adding to the stakes of the story. That's adding to the stakes of this trip, which we expect, because of the way that we get this prolepsis and this backstory, that the trip will contribute in some way to their dissolution. We also get this backstory as a way of showing us the difference between their past and their present and their future, right? We see them in a state of change. In the current story, they are different from the people they grew up as, but they're also not yet the people who they are when they're broken up. And of course, we also get this backstory as a lot of character development, right? It's really rich character development, and we learn so much about the characters here and about their lives, and we're able to go along with it because of the sort of mystery that it's building into the story and the way that it's upping the stakes. Monroe also uses a lot of imagined scenes. You might think a friend of my youth, right, for example. But here she uses imagination as a way to kind of to go along with the backstory, but also to go along with the very tense, dramatic moments, right? The backstory at the beginning of the boy who drowned, she admits is also an imagined scene, right? That she as a girl did not see all of this, or did see it, but doesn't remember it exactly, and is recreating it from imagination. That lends a sort of authenticity, I think, to the scene and to the voice. It lets us believe that the voice is being honest with us, because the way that we do see the things, because the way that we do recreate our memories is not by an exact science, it's by largely imagination or reimagination. I also want to talk about imagined scenes and prolepsis in the story Walking Out. But let's put that aside for 1 second and let's talk about prolepsis, which is this flash forward, like the way that we flash forward to see that they are broken up. Why would we flash forward like that? Well, one, to change the emphasis of the story, to change the emphasis of the mystery. We're changing it from whether or not this story affects their marriage, right? Do they stay up together or do they break apart? To how does this road trip affect their marriage, right? How do they break up? How is this moment important in that breaking up? And that's a very interesting shift, I think, because Monroe is much more interested in the emotional arc here, the emotional change, than the change of what happened. The role of imagination plays into that. The role of the near death instead of death at the end plays into that. Monroe is really working not with the surprises and turns of a page-turning plot, but the surprises in terms of an emotional arc, an emotional journey to go along with this road trip. This leads us directly into true and false mystery. And without putting any value on those terms, because both true and false mystery have a lot to offer us, and both offer things in the Monroe story, true mystery is often a mystery of how and why, and false mystery is often a mystery of what. A good example is in a noirish murder mystery where we have that hard-boiled detective narrator um, looking back at a case from a future point of time. The detective knows who done it and isn't telling us until later in the story. That's a false mystery because the story and the characters in the story and the person telling the story knows what happens and is withholding it from us. Who done it is a false mystery that adds a ton to a mystery story, right? We do really want to know who done it, and we do really want that to be a mystery, right? In a different story, whodunit might be the thing we learn right off the bat, right? In a Monroe story, we might know that right away, and the focus might shift to the true mystery, which also is usually present in the mystery story, but it's the mystery of how did this affect the character emotionally, and that's something we need to go through as the reader, which can't just be told to us, revealed to us by the narrator who knows what happened, because the journey of how it happened is the mystery, and it's the journey that we're going through with the narrator of the story. In the Monroe story, that's how this road trip affects their lives. In the murder mystery, that's how this case affects the narrator down the road to the present where he's telling the story from. Both of these things are very useful. And in the Monroe story, we do have the kind of false mystery of the near drowning, right? We are set up to think by the backstory at the beginning that there's going to be a drowning or something dangerous with water in children. And the narrator could just diffuse that suspense by telling us that nothing that terrible happens to her children. But we use that false mystery as well as the true mystery to help guide the reader and propel the reader through the story. In David Quammen's story, Walking Out, there's a kind of prolepsis where when we know that the father must die, right? He knew, this is on page 433 of the version from Short Story Masterpieces. He knew from the noises and movements that his father must die. We know too there that the father must die, although we don't really register when the father dies until much later in the story, and the boy doesn't on the surface register that either. Now, why do we have that prolepsis? How does that shift the mystery of the story? It shifts it from whether the father dies or not, right? Which isn't really what the story is about, to how the boy handles that death and how the boy gets out, walks out of the story with his father on his back and the emotional weight of his dead father on his back. Now that ties into these imagined scenes at this crucial moment while he's really about to get out. This comes on page 436 and 437. First, we have the boy imagining his mother back safe in Evergreen Park, perhaps getting news that the boy, has died. And then we have the boy imagining himself at his father's grave after the funeral. The first imagined scene reminds us that this boy has come from a totally different world and will return to that totally different world, and that larger world still exists, and that this smaller world is going to have a huge impact in that larger world for the boy. Now, right, that's about stakes and arc and character change, and about bringing the depth to the world of the story. The second imagined scene is where I always think this must be where the boy realizes that the father is dead, and that's why he's imagining himself at the father's grave later. There's a certain emotional impact here. It gives us a sort of epilogue to the story without having it feel tacked on at the end. The boy is imagining himself alone with all of the responsibility of manhood and head of household, hunter, all of the roles that his father has played for him subconsciously. We need this scene to come as an imagined scene, because if it came at the end of the story, it would feel very anticlimactic. By the end of the story, the boy has changed completely. He's a totally different person from when he started the story. The point where the imagined scene comes is still within that change. It is while the boy is making that change, and it is part of that change. And that gives it an extra power for the reader and lets us feel more the change that the boy is making physically, emotionally, mentally, and the permanence of that change when it is a change of perspective.